why is the thought that we construct the world through our concepts so tempting to philosophers when it looks as though it's going to lead to absurdity? Because, not merely for the fact that I mentioned that two people who are in the same room can be said to be living in different worlds, but because many of the facts that we talk about antedate human existence. Now, Rorty, unlike Latour, was very aware of the dangers of coming close to saying that human beings made it the case that dinosaurs existed on Earth. You know, he wanted to find a way of, say, denying that there could be facts that are independent of our conceptual schemes, but he was very well aware that the last way you wanted to put that is to say that we somehow or other made it the case that these things existed before we did. So he says, and I'll quote from him, he says, people like, and he acknowledges this, people like Goodman, Putnam, and myself, people who think there is no description-independent way the world is, no way it is under no description, keep being tempted to use Kantian form-matter metaphors. We are tempted to say that there were no objects before language shaped the raw material, a lot of Ding an sichi, all content and no scheme stuff. He had a funny way with words. But as soon as we say anything like this, we find ourselves accused, plausibly, of making the false causal claim that the invention of the word dinosaur, the concept dinosaur, caused dinosaurs to come into existence, of being what our opponents call linguistic idealists. So the very thing that Latour seems to embrace. But he insisted that there was a different and perfectly legitimate way to make sense of this idea of fact constructivism, as I will call it. And he says, and let me quote this passage, "None of us anti-representationalists, as he called himself, have ever doubted that most things in the universe are causally independent of us. What we question is whether they are representationally independent of us." And he gives an explanation of what it is to be representationally independent. For X to be representationally independent of us is for X to have an intrinsic feature such that it is better described by some of our terms rather than others. Because we can see no way of deciding which descriptions of an object get at what is intrinsic to it, as opposed to its merely relational, descriptive, relative features, we are prepared to discard the intrinsic-extrinsic distinction, the claim that beliefs represent, and the whole question of representational independence or dependence. This means, he says, discarding the idea of, as Bernard Williams has put it, how things are anyway, apart from how or whether they are described. Okay, so that's the end of that complicated passage. Let me walk you through that passage a little bit, because it moves very quickly. He wants to say, dinosaurs are not causally dependent on us. That seems right. But they are rather representationally dependent on us. And what does it mean for something to be representationally dependent on us? He says, consists in their not having any intrinsic features that would allow us to say that some of our descriptions better describe what they are than others of our descriptions. And Rorty goes on to say, because we can't decide which of their features are intrinsic and which are description dependent, we are prepared to discard the whole distinction. And since we are prepared to discard the whole distinction, we are prepared to discard the whole question of representational independence versus dependence. Now, you should think, wait, what just happened there? You know, you started out saying that you doubt the thesis of representational independence. That makes it sound like you affirm representational dependence. But he ends up saying that he rejects the very question to which representational dependence would be an answer. And that all happens in that one little paragraph. Now look, strictly speaking, that's not a contradiction. You can have the view that if you were to take a certain question seriously, are they dependent or not dependent, then any answer you give to that would be one that you don't like. So you want to reject the question. That can happen. It's like Oscar Wilde when he was asked, you know, do you blaspheme against God? He said, blasphemy is not one of my words. It's like, it's not a word I can even use in a question, so I reject the whole question. But here lies a deep point, because you see, once you take seriously the question, could there be such a thing as reality as it is in itself, that is independently of our descriptions of it, there is no option but to answer yes. Every other answer lands you in absurdity. And the reason is that there is no fancy notion of dependence, not causal or otherwise, that's going to make it sound okay to say that facts about dinosaurs depend upon us. There is no notion of dependence. That is not, he thinks as long as it's not causal dependence, it's fine. No, he realizes even if you say it's not causal dependence, some other kind of dependence, it's metaphysical dependence, it's supervenience, it's grounds, it's whatever it is, none of that is true. None of that works. So there is no notion of dependence that's going to make that claim sound okay. That means there is no way of saying it. They are, in some sense or other, dependent on us. That means you have to reject the question. But how could there be something wrong with this question? It's you started out with this question, and in fact what you wanted to say was, no, they're not independent of us. There is an important sense in which they're not independent of us. So the dilemma is this. Either you ask the question, in which case the only answer is yes, or you find some fancy way of saying that the question is incoherent and change the subject. But really that A doesn't work, because I understand the question perfectly well. I understand the person perfectly well because I will give you examples of things that aren't independent of human beings. Okay, and I will come to those in a minute. Of course, all social objects, for instance, or all mental objects are not independent of human minds. So we know that question perfectly well. And we can ask it about the dinosaurs. Okay, and there is no good answer to that that's anything other than yes. So, and moreover, by the way, most of the writings, when he's not worried about this problem, he is full of affirmation that you can't say that they are totally independent of us. Now, the question is, given that this is such a slightly blindingly compelling, I think, argument, the question is why people were so attracted to this view of fact constructivism. And I think, there are probably many different answers to this in the case of different people, many different motivations. Kant's motivation, of course, Kant's big motivation for getting into transcendental idealism is that he thought it was essential for explaining synthetic a priori knowledge. Okay, that would be very, very far from Rorty's motivation, who didn't like any of those. He didn't like the analytic-synthetic distinction, didn't like the a priori, a posteriori distinction. So that wouldn't have been his motivation. Part of what's going on, I think, in Rorty's case, and I think in the case of many others, is that they run together the thesis of fact constructivism or fact anti-realism with another thesis that is, although I think not in the end true, much more plausible. And that is the thesis that I call the social relativity of the usefulness of descriptions. Okay, big word. And I'll quote a passage from Rorty in which he talks about this. Basically, this is the pragmatist view of knowledge or of the utility of certain ways of describing the world. So you might think that when you want to explain why it is that people accept certain kinds of concepts and certain kinds of theories, you have to look at what their interests are, and you have to look at what their size is, for instance, relative to the things that they're investigating. So he says, we describe giraffes as we do as giraffes because of our needs and interests. We speak a language which includes the word giraffe because it suits our purposes to do so. The same goes for words like organ, cell, atom, and so on, the names of the parts out of which giraffes are made, so to speak. All the descriptions we give of things are suited to our purposes. The line between a giraffe and the surrounding air is clear enough if you are a human being interested in hunting for meat. But if you are a space voyager or an amoeba, that line is not so clear, and it is not so clear that you would need or have a word for giraffe in your language. The point about this is, even if you I think that isn't the correct epistemological story about why we accept certain theories or why we have certain concepts. It's not the full story, though sometimes our own interests and needs and scale and so on can be relevant to explaining why we are interested in certain questions and also why we come to adopt certain views about the world. But the main point is that, you see, he routinely went from that pragmatist view about acceptance to this anti-realist view about fact. So he often says, after he gives this passage, he says, more generally, it's not clear that any of the millions of ways of describing the bit of space-time occupied by what you call a giraffe is closer to the way things are in and of themselves than any of the others. And the crucial point is that the fact constructivism, that fact anti-realism that he states more generally, is not in any way a generalization of what came before. They're just completely independent points. It is one thing to say that we have to explain our acceptance of certain descriptions in terms of our practical interests, rather than in terms of their correspondence to the way things are in and of themselves. And it's quite another thing to say that there is no such thing as a way things are in and of themselves, independently of our descriptions. That's just a major logical gap, and it's constantly being elided. I mean, to see this, you see, one of the things that people often do is they think realism commits you to there being a single true description of any given bit of space-time. Okay? And the fact is, even on a realist view, any given bit of space-time will have potential infinity of correct descriptions, because there are an infinite number of relational properties, for instance. So just to give a silly example, you might have the giraffe chewing on an acacia tree, but that giraffe might also be a creature in Donald Trump's garden, because he's got a lot of money, he can buy a giraffe probably. So that, to say it's an object in Donald Trump's garden and to say that it's a giraffe chewing on an acacia tree are two perfectly correct descriptions, and then there's a million others or an infinite number of others, okay? The point is that to say that there is a fact of the matter doesn't commit you to there being only one thing that's true, but it does commit you to not everything's being true when said about that bit of space-time. So for instance, if I take that giraffe, which is also in Donald Trump's garden, but I say of it that it's an asteroid, then that's false, you see? So, and that's just dictated by the facts and, of course, the meanings of the words. So realism does not commit you to there being one true description, but it does commit you to not everything being true all at the same time of any particular bit of space-time.